Hello, Bible readers. Walter Brueggemann calls the Joseph narrative the hidden call of God, as opposed to the embraced call of God for the Abraham narrative, and you might remember the conflicted call of God for the Jacob narrative. Joseph is about the hidden call because it's just different from anything else in Genesis, the way it's written and the way God is spoken of, and actually not spoken of as often, tells scholars that this narrative must come from a very different time with very different priorities and very different questions than the Abraham or Jacob stories had. Brueggemann says this narrative appears to belong to a generation of believers in a cultural climate where old modes of faith were embarrassing. Thus, the narrative should be understood as a literary response to a cultural and theological crisis. Here's the question they seem to be addressing, and it's a really good one, I think, for our day too. How does one speak about faith in a context where the old ways are found wanting? This is the issue of the Joseph narrative. Interesting, right? The theological claims of the Joseph narrative are implicit. They're subdued. It's not like God speaks a whole lot, or that the characters pray a whole lot, or that there's a lot of direct encounter, confrontation, or direction. But there is a point. Within history, God works in hidden and mysterious ways. That's the point. And it's a big point. We won't hear the narrator repeating God's demand for radical trust, like we heard in the Abraham stories. We're not going to hear conflict being so valued as a way of seeing that God is truly present and willing to keep promises even through a striving schemer like Jacob. In the Joseph narrative, we see the mysterious and hidden ways of God. They will persist in and through the happenings of this world. There's no appeal for a faith response. Instead, we see that the ways of God are just at work, regardless of human attitudes or human actions. The Joseph stories take a very high view of God, so high that human action is declared irrelevant. Not only his brothers, but Joseph even, is unaware until the very end of the ways of God in keeping the dream. Hopefully you were with me through the Jacob stories, and if yes, you're going to remember that there was an oracle shared in chapter 25, verse 23. Part of it says, "The elder shall serve the younger." Well, that oracle shaped the whole Jacob narrative, right? Well, here, Joseph's dream in chapter 37, verses 5 to 9, that dream does the same thing for the whole Joseph narrative. The entire story is going to be concerned that the family and the empire should bow down. And by the end, by chapter 50, they will have all bowed down. The last thing I'm going to say as food for thought before I dive deep into chapter 37, I'll probably be saying more about that in my next post. The other thing I want to share was the time when scholars think this was all committed to papyrus. The question scholars ask is not simply, when was this written? But to figure out when it was written, they ask a deeper question. In what cultural, intellectual context might this kind of literary statement have been achieved? It's an interesting question, and it makes me think like 2,000 years from now, people might ask, in what cultural, intellectual context might the first flight to the moon have been achieved, right? Like you see an achievement and you're like, well, how did that possibly happen? You know, to know about that first flight to the moon, let's say we didn't have books on it and we just had to guess, to know why the United States would spend that much money to do something that unreasonable, they'd have to know, the people of the future would have to know the details of the rivalry between the United States and the USSR, right? Like a very unique set of circumstances made our nation wealthy enough, smart enough, intellectually smart enough, and motivated enough to go to the moon. Like we couldn't gather that kind of motivation now. what would have had to be going on in Israel this long ago for Israel to produce this Joseph narrative? So that's the kind of thing that biblical scholars ask. And an educated guess, seeing what the Joseph narrative is trying to say, what it's claiming, well, an educated guess would be that it must have been during King Solomon's reign. King Solomon's reign is such an outlier in the history of Israel. It's a remarkable time in the life of the whole community. It's a time for flexing muscles and being secure in one's own strength. In that kind of context, one can ask about the relationship between power and faith. In a time of knowing so much, doing so much, so competently, what does it mean then, in those moments, to trust in God? Is God relevant to a social situation where humans seem to be in full control and are doing just fine on their own, seemingly? I mean, it's a great question for our postmodern humanity that's pretty impressed with ourselves most of the time. Where is God in all this is my ongoing question. Specifically for Joseph, the question is, where is God in our strength and security and wisdom and might? We'll see that the answer of the narrator is God is hidden, but God is reliable. So tomorrow, chapter 37, I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.